The most famous voice in the world went silent one morning in October 1975, not because it had run out of things to say, not because the machine had finally broken down, not because the person behind the voice had burned out or lost the thread of what he had been trying to communicate since he was a teenager in Liverpool. The voice went silent because the person it belonged to had made a decision quietly, without announcement, without the kind of dramatic public gesture that his life had trained the world to expect from him, to do something that no one in his position had ever seriously considered doing. John Lennon decided to go home, not home in the metaphorical sense, not home as a concept or a creative destination or a lyrical refrain. Home in the specific, physical, daily sense. The Dakota apartment on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, the kitchen where breakfast needed to be made, the nursery where a newborn named Sean Lennon had arrived on October 9, 1975, John's own 35th birthday, and was lying in a crib waiting for someone to be his father. And John Lennon, who had been everything to everyone for 15 years, the spokesman for a generation, the voice of a movement, the product the machine had been manufacturing without pause since 1963, looked at his son and sent the nanny home and closed the door. What happened inside that apartment over the next 5 years is not the story that the public narrative of his career usually tells. It is quieter than that story, more ordinary than that story. And in every way that finally matters, more important. To understand why John Lennon closed the door in October 1975, you have to understand what had been behind it before he closed. Not the Beatles, the world has catalogued that chapter exhaustively. Not the political activism, the bed-ins and the protests and the FBI surveillance. Not even the Plastic Ono band album or Imagine. You have to understand something that sits underneath all of those things, something that rarely gets discussed because it is not dramatic enough for the kind of story that gets told about famous people. You have to understand what fame actually did to his days. A day in the life of John Lennon in 1972 looked approximately like this. Wake up in an apartment selected and secured by other people for reasons related to protection rather than comfort. Attend meetings with lawyers, managers, record company executives, political organizers, journalists, the various constituencies that had claims on the time and attention of someone who had spent a decade becoming a symbol. Make music in contexts that were professional rather than exploratory. Give interviews in which carefully managed versions of the truth were offered to people who wanted a story. Be recognized everywhere. Be able to go nowhere unobserved, unaccompanied, unmediated by the apparatus of being famous. And at the end of that day, return to a home that contained, in those years, in the period of the Lowe's Angels' separation from Yoko and its difficult aftermath, very little of what the word home is supposed to mean. John had spoken about this with the directness that was one of his most consistent qualities, about the loneliness of constant visibility, about the way fame created a permanent distance between the actual person and every other person, because every other person was responding not to the actual person, but to the idea of the person, the product, the symbol, about the way the machine of celebrity, running continuously since 1963, consumed everything you fed it and generated in return something that looked like success and felt like a form of imprisonment impossible to explain to people who had never been inside it. He had tried to find ways out of the machine without stopping it entirely. The political activism, the primal therapy with Arthur Janov. The relationship with Yoko Ono, whose avant-garde practice and personal stubbornness had always refused to accommodate the machine's requirements, a partnership built on the principle that the actual person mattered more than the product. None of it had resolved the fundamental problem. The machine was still running, the obligations were still there, and the person inside the machine was still, in the specific and private sense that no amount of public recognition addresses alone. The separation from Yoko Ono that began in late 1973, the period John would later call his lost weekend, though it lasted 18 months, was, by his own account and by the accounts of everyone around him, the closest he came to fully losing himself. He was in Lowe's Angels with May Pang. He was recording Walls and Bridges, which produced his only #1 solo single, Whatever Gets You Through the Night, but making it in the distracted, unfocused way of someone doing it, because they know how rather than because it is answering any question that actually needs answering. He was drinking too much, behaving in ways he later acknowledged with an honesty both impressive and painful to read. And in Lowe's Angels, he was beginning to understand something that the therapy with Arthur Janov had started to reveal, that the life fame had built around him was not serving him, that the constant movement, city to city, project to project, obligation to obligation, was not a sign of vitality but of the opposite, that the noise he had been living inside for 15 years was the sound of a life being continuously managed, continuously performed, continuously produced for an audience that would never be satisfied and could never give back what it was taking. He returned to Yoko Ono in early 1975. The return was not simple or uncomplicated, but it was genuine. And in the months that followed, as Yoko's pregnancy progressed and as the birth of their son approached, something was forming in John that the public record would later describe as withdrawal or retirement, but which was, from the inside, something considerably more specific. He was deciding to choose, for the first time in his adult life since the machine had started running in his early 20s and had not stopped. He was deciding to choose what mattered rather than allowing the machine to make that choice for him by filling every available space with obligation. Sean Lennon was born at New York Hospital on October 9, 1975, John's own 35th birthday. The coincidence was not lost on him. He would refer to it in interviews as something that felt designed, as though the universe had timed it with a deliberateness that rational accounting could not quite explain away. John was present for the birth. He had been present for Julian's birth 14 years earlier, but present in the way the era required, nearby, informed, and then quickly absorbed back into the machine. This time was different. When the nurses placed Sean in his arms, John looked at his son's face and felt responsible, not in the abstract, managed sense that the machine understood responsibility. In the specific, daily, physical sense, this person needed him, not the product, not the symbol, him. The nanny arrived at the apartment in the days following the birth. She was professional, qualified, equipped for the job by every practical measure. John sent her home. Not permanently, not entirely. The subsequent 5 years were not managed without any domestic assistance, and the account that presents John as a solitary domestic saint performing every task alone is a simplification he would have found both flattering and inaccurate. But the nanny was not going to be the primary presence in his son's daily life. John was. That was the decision made in the first days of Sean's life, and what followed was the long, daily, entirely unglamorous work of living it. The domestic years, from late 1975 to late 1980, the period John spent at the Dakota being Sean's primary caregiver, while Yoko Ono managed the business affairs of the Lennon household, have been described in various ways in the decades since John's death. Some accounts romanticize them beyond recognition, turning daily childcare into a kind of saintly martyrdom that John himself would have found hilarious. Some accounts minimize them, presenting them as an extended vacation taken by a man who had lost his creative drive. Neither is accurate. What the 5 years actually looked like, pieced together from the accounts of Fred Seaman, who worked as an assistant to the Lennons, May Pang, who remained in contact, and Yoko Ono herself, was both more ordinary and more extraordinary than either the romantic or the dismissive. Version suggests John woke up and made breakfast. He made Sean's breakfast specifically, learning the preferences of a small child and accommodating them with the patience of someone who has decided that this matters. He took Sean to Central Park when the weather permitted, navigating the extraordinary logistics of being John Lennon in a public space. He took him to museums and restaurants. He read to him. He played music for him, not professionally, not toward any product, just played the way he had played before the machine existed, in the pure exploratory mode of someone for whom music was a language rather than a career. He baked bread. This detail has been repeated so often it has taken on the quality of shorthand for everything the domestic years represented, but it is worth pausing on. John Lennon, who had not cooked in any sustained way for the entire duration of his adult life, learned to make bread. He made it badly at first and then better, and he took satisfaction from the improving a man who had achieved the highest recognition the world offers in his domain, finding genuine satisfaction in the modest, entirely unwitnessed accomplishment of making a better loaf than he had made the week before. He was not always happy. The domestic years were not a continuous idyll of fulfillment and peace. There were periods of restlessness, the creative instinct pushing against the choice he had made. Moments of doubt: was this the right decision? Was he wasting what he had? There were days when the smallness of the domestic routine, the meals, the naps, the park, the bedtime, the same sequence repeating, felt claustrophobic rather than grounding. But there was also something else. Something harder to name in the moment, but clearer in retrospect. The domestic years were giving John Lennon something the entire previous 20 years of his life had not provided: the experience of being necessary to a specific person in a way that had nothing to do with what he had made or what he was famous for. Sean did not care that his father had written in my life or stood on a stage in front of 50,000 people. Sean cared that his father was there in the morning when he woke up. And John was there every morning, without fail, for 5 years. Yoko Ono managed the Lennons' business affairs during those 5 years, the deliberate division of the domestic and professional spheres that both their accounts confirmed genuinely worked. Yoko had always been the more practically minded of the two when it came to financial matters, and the arrangement gave her a domain in which her intelligence could operate without the constant complication of John's fame overwhelming everything. She negotiated, she invested. She was, in the language the era would not yet have used easily, the breadwinner. What she observed during those 5 years she has described with a care that suggests the observation was important to her. She has said that John changed during those years in ways that the touring years and the political years and the therapeutic years had all pointed toward but none had fully achieved. That the person who baked bread in the Dakota kitchen and took Sean to Central Park and read picture books at bedtime was the most fully himself that John Lennon ever was in the time she knew him. Not the most productive, not the most visible, the most himself, she has also said, and this is the detail that carries the most weight, coming from the person who observed it most closely, that John was, during those years, happy. Not the performing happiness of someone who has decided that happiness is the appropriate public posture. The quiet, specific, daily happiness of someone who has found the thing they were looking for and is living inside it, and does not need to announce it because the living is itself the announcement. John did not stop making music entirely during the 5 years. He wrote in notebooks. He played guitar, he recorded sketches and fragments at the grand piano in the Dakota, not toward any release, but in the exploratory, personal, purposeless mode that is actually the condition from which music comes before it becomes something the world can hear. He was doing what the Beatles' years and the early solo years had made very difficult: making music without a destination. Some of those fragments would eventually become Double Fantasy, the album he recorded with Yoko Ono in 1980 when the restlessness had accumulated to the point where the creative instinct could no longer be contained by the domestic frame. But most remained fragments, sketches of songs never finished, ideas explored and then set aside, the private residue of a creative life being lived for its own sake rather than for any audience. In interviews he gave in 1980, he said it was the most honest music he had ever made. The only music he had ever made that he was entirely certain no one would ever hear, and that this certainty, the absolute privacy of it, had allowed him to go places in the music that the pressure of making something for an audience had always, in some degree, prevented. The music no one heard may have been the best music John Lennon ever made. There is no way to know. That is part of what makes the 5 years both extraordinary and irreducibly private. Sean Lennon grew up. He learned to walk in the Dakota apartment, the same building where a few years later his father would be killed. He learned to talk in the presence of a father who was genuinely, daily there. He grew up with a father who made breakfast and took him to the park and read to him and played music in the kitchen not as a performance but as a fact of life, the way water and light were facts of life. He has spoken about his father with the particular care of someone navigating the impossible task of having a private grief that is also a public inheritance. He has said that what he remembers, what he returns to when he thinks about his father, is not the music, though the music is always there, but something simpler, the specific quality of his father's presence, the way John Lennon in those 5 years was there. Sean has said something that cuts through all the mythology and all the iconography that has accumulated around his father's name. He has said, "I knew him, not the icon, not the artist, my father. I knew him because he was there every morning when I woke up." and that knowing, specific, ordinary, irreplaceable, is what the 5 years gave him. It is also what John Lennon never had from his own father. Alfred Lennon left when John was 5. Julia Lennon died when John was 17. The specific, ordinary, daily presence of a parent was not something John had grown up inside, and yet he gave it with a deliberateness that was itself a form of courage to Sean. He gave the thing he had not received. He became the father he had not had. In 1980, John Lennon emerged. The 5 years were over. Sean was 5 years old, the same age John had been when Alfred Lennon left. He had stayed for the duration of Sean's earliest years. He had given his son what his father had not given him. And now the creative instinct, patient and powerful and impossible to permanently contain, was pulling him back toward the world. He and Yoko Ono recorded Double Fantasy at the Hit Factory in New York through the summer and autumn of 1980. The album was lighter in tone than the Plastic Ono band material, domestic in its concerns, songs about being a father and being in love and the pleasure of ordinary mornings. It was not the most celebrated work of his career, but it was, in a specific sense, the most honest, because what the album described, the value of the small, daily. Private Things was not a position John was taking for artistic reasons. It was a report from inside a life he had actually been living. He was giving interviews again, talking to journalists with an openness and a groundedness that surprised the people who had known him in the early 1970s. He seemed settled. He seemed, and this was the word that appeared most consistently in the accounts of people who encountered him during those final months, present. Not the managed presence of someone performing engagement. The actual presence of someone who has spent 5 years learning to be in a room rather than moving through it. What was coming next was more music, more albums, possibly a tour, something John had not done since 1966, something he had long maintained he would never do again, but which the restored creative energy of 1980 was making imaginable. For the first time in years, the future, which during the 5 years had been a kind of deliberately kept blank, was filling in. There was more to say, there were more songs, there was a world to re-enter, changed by the absence and ready for what the absence had made possible. And then December 8th came, and the future that had been filling in went blank again. John Lennon was 40 years old when he died. He had spent approximately 20 of those 40 years inside the machine, the Beatles machine and then the solo machine, the apparatus of celebrity that consumed everything you fed it. And he had spent 5 years outside it, in the kitchen of the Dakota apartment, being the father his son needed him to be. The 5 years have been variously characterized in the decades since his death, as a gift, as a withdrawal, as a creative pause, as the most radical thing a rock star had ever done. All of these characterizations contain something true, and none contains the whole truth. The whole truth is both simpler and harder to hold. The whole truth is that John Lennon, who had been given everything that fame promises and who had found that the gift left specific and important things entirely unaddressed, chose to spend 5 years addressing them. He chose his son. He chose the morning. He chose the bread in the park and the bedtime story. He chose, against every incentive that his position in the world provided for choosing otherwise, the ordinary thing. And in choosing the ordinary thing, he did something that the extraordinary years had never quite managed. He became, for 5 years, fully himself, not the product, not the symbol, not the most famous voice of his generation, just a man. In an apartment in New York, doing the thing that needed to be done for the person who needed him to do it. The voice came back in 1980 with Double Fantasy, and then it stopped again, permanently and without warning, on a December evening outside the Dakota. But what it left behind in the music and in the memory of the people who knew John Lennon during those 5 years is not only the extraordinary catalog of a great artist. It is the evidence of a man who understood, late and with difficulty and completely, what his life was actually for, and who chose, for 5 years, to live accordingly. There is an image that does not exist as a photograph. It was not documented, not captured, not preserved in any archive. It is simply an image that those who knew John Lennon during those years carry in their minds as a kind of emblem of the whole period. The thing that the 5 years looked like when you reduced them to a single frame. John Lennon in the kitchen of the Dakota apartment early in the morning before the city has fully woken up, making bread, not performing making bread, not making bread toward any audience or any purpose beyond the making of it. Just standing at the counter, his hands in the dough, the window behind him showing the gray morning light of Central Park, the apartment quiet around him. In a few hours, Sean will wake up and need breakfast, and the day will begin its ordinary requirements. But in this moment, John is simply here, present without performance, still without the stillness being a managed posture, himself without the self being a product, the most famous voice in the world in the quietest morning of its life. He had closed the door in October 1975. And what he had found behind it, in the bread and the park visits and the bedtime stories and the daily, ordinary, irreplaceable fact of being there, was not what the world would have expected him to find. It was not a retreat. It was not a withdrawal. It was the thing that all the extraordinary years had been pointing toward without quite arriving at, the discovery that the ordinary things, lived fully and without performance, are the most important things. And that when you finally understand that, when you finally close the door on everything the world has told you to want and stand in the kitchen with your hands in the dough and the morning light coming through the window, you have not disappeared from the world. You have, for the first time, fully arrived in it.